Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Islamic Book Reviews with myself, al-Azami, and my dear friend and colleague, Omar Anchassi. This week we're going to be discussing a book by Phil Dorroll entitled Islamic Theology in the Turkish Republic. As usual, please do sort of like, follow and subscribe. It helps the channel, inshallah. Our format is as usual. Omar will be presenting on the book for the next 10-15 minutes, followed by me engaging in a Q&A with him for half an hour to 45 minutes. And we'll open up the floor. You can actually write in comments and questions in the chat, particularly on YouTube and Facebook. And we'll start addressing that later on in the course of the evening. But without further ado, I'd like you, Omar, to press ahead and introduce the book for this week, inshallah.
Sure. It's always a pleasure to read about a subject that I do not know well at all, and especially one where, because of the language barrier, I do not read the primary sources. So that's always an educational experience. Phil Dorroll's book explores the origins, formation, and subsequent development of Islamic theology in the Turkish Republic. So he does look at the late Ottoman period as well. And there are interesting continuities between the late Ottoman and the Republican period, the Republic being established in 1923. And broadly, the book argues that Turkish theology, or modern Turkish theology, is a distinctive theological tradition in modern Islam that is watered by three major traditions: late Ottoman Kalam, and I'm sure we'll discuss this a lot more in the discussion later on. Also, the late Ottoman and early Republican traditions of modernism, as we would call it. And finally, by a third ingredient, if you like, that, I mean, as far as I can establish, seems to me distinctively Turkish, that is sociological theory, especially the kind advocated by Ziya Gökalp, dies 1924, whom Dorroll characterizes as really one of the most influential, you could say, figures in modern Turkish intellectual history. I mean, in many ways, he lays the foundation off which some theologians build in a variety of ways. And I should apologize in advance because, somewhat embarrassingly, I have a real problem with remembering Turkish names specifically. And also I have a habit of Arabizing them as well. So punctilious scholars of the Turkish language will, I'm sure, be very upset at this episode, but I'll do my best. Inshallah, the book is divided into 5 body chapters, a longish introduction and short sort of a conclusion or an afterthought. The chapters, note the order, by the way. Firstly, on origins. Chapter 2 on nation, which comes interestingly before chapter 3, which is on God. Chapter 4 on humanity, and chapter 5 on futures, or the kind of prospects and horizons of Turkish theology. Now, I do have interest in the modern period, but I always find the medieval and pre-modern stuff usually more exciting, and that part of the book is addressed at length in the first chapter on origin. So I've said there are these three kind of main currents that lead to the establishment of Turkish theology, modern Turkish theology. So, and I should say, if you compare the book to Phil's, and we'll call him Phil, I guess we have been corresponding for a while. If you compare it to Phil's thesis, it's a substantially different piece of work. The first 3 chapters of the thesis at Emory University really focus on al-Maturidi and his reception and the school and its subsequent history. So something it's always a great relief for me to notice. Phil has published and has researched, and based on even the book, is very clearly competent with the pre-modern sources, and that's something that's very important to me personally. Right. So he cites in the book even, E.G. and many others. And I remember in the footnote something, a discussion of Schacht's paper on the attribution of al-alam wal-muta'allim attributed to Abu Hanifa, which he says is a 9th century text or cannot predate the 9th century. And he says, Phil then makes the point that it's cited in Sabuni's Bidayah fil Hidayah or whatever it's called. So he's actually read these texts and he's published on this and is, I'm sure, I think with a bit of extra work actually he could squeeze a second book out of his thesis. But anyway, so some of that material makes it, from those first 3 chapters of the 3 theses, makes it into the bit on origins and elsewhere in the book. And he talks about, establishing this point about interesting continuities and also departures from the late Ottoman tradition. One thing it's really important to bear in mind, and this is something that's true even in the period after 2011, where he argues the AK party becomes kind of more authoritarian. Ottoman intellectual culture and its institutional landscape, in some respects, is without precedent in Islamdom. It is far more centralized, far more bureaucratized, and even career paths are much more rigidly controlled than is ever the case, as far as I'm aware, in any other context. There's a lot of scholarship on different elements of this now, whether it's Guy Burak focusing on law and curricula and so on, and one could think of other examples. Abdurrahman Achel's book Scholars and Sultans, which argues that this development really emerges after 1453 with Istanbul and so on, the creation of an Ottoman learned hierarchy. So you have, the key point for our consideration is this process of bureaucratization of the religious elites and centralization and institutionalization is already there in important respects long before the modern period. So in terms of Ottoman intellectual life, he discusses theology, and modern Turkish theology is in important respects an outgrowth. Of course, it's more than this, but in important respects is an outgrowth of the Ottoman Kalam tradition. So this is the kind of definition of theology in this context. And what kinds of, we have an idea, he says, of the kinds of texts that were taught in the 15th and 16th century. And it's the usual suspects. And these texts remain important into, right up until the end of the period. So when he discusses the very important work of Ismail Haqi Izmirli, who dies in 1946, who is really the preeminent late Ottoman early Republic theologian in a kind of Kalam sense, who in 1923 to 24 publishes his large work, Yani Ilm al-Kalam, or the new Kalam. I think some more scholarship has to be done on this trend because it's not, of course, distinctive to the Ottoman world. It's much broader, but he writes this work and he's citing Giorgiani and so on. So what are the kinds of texts studied in the 15th and 16th century, unsurprisingly? Giorgiani's commentary on E.G.'s Mawaqif, Giorgiani's commentary on Tusi's Tajrid, Nasiruddin Tusi, Shi'i thinker whose Tajrid al-I'tiqad or Tajrid al-Aqaid, it's known by various titles, is still the advanced Kalam work taught in the Hawza today. So you do have this interesting kind of cross-sectarian phenomenon.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of your thing.
Sure.
But, perhaps I'll ask about the sort of cross-sectarian thing after you finish, so we'll get back
Yes,
to it.
and I can see we're already nearly 10 minutes in, so this episode is going to be a bit longer than usual, and we've both agreed that's fine. If our listeners, have patience, they can. So these kinds of texts, also Taftazani's Sharh al-Aqaid, to a much lesser extent, he doesn't really dwell on it, but it's also his Sharh al-Maqasid. Sharh al-Aqaid of Nasafi and also the Sharh al-Maqasid. And if you read, for instance, what's his face? If you read the memoirs of the famous Egyptian minister of education, Taha Hussein, he says that Sharh al-Maqasid was taught al-Azhar when he was a student and so on. So these kinds of texts, and they attract many commentaries and so on. And one interesting piece of scholarship I hadn't been aware of is in terms of what direction does Ottoman theological culture lean in, Ash'ari or Maturidi, these kind of two major Sunni schools of Kalam. He points to the very interesting thesis that I looked at by Yahya Ra'ad Haidar at the Australian National University 2016 on basically Ottoman Asharism, Maturidism, and so on, which uses many manuscripts. And the argument of Haidar, which is endorsed by Phil, is basically that Asharism seems to dominate early on, although there is a recognition that both schools of theology are valid. However, Haidar's argument, at least, is in the 17th century, late 17th century onwards, especially with the work of Bayaldi Zada, the son of a Bosnian migrant to Istanbul he dies in 1687. From that period onwards, the kind of defense and assertion of the Maturidi school becomes dominant. And in the 18th century, you have controversy over ideas about ikhtiyar and free will that lead to, even some accusing Asharism of Jabr and, extreme predeterministic belief and so on. In terms of I've really focused a lot on the origins bit so far, but we will, of course, expand. And very briefly, I'll make this my last point about origins, unless it comes up again. The first Ottoman madrasa is established in Iznik in 1331, if memory serves. And between then and 1451, 2 years before the conquest of Constantinople, at least 84 other madaris are founded. And the process of institutionalization and bureaucratization continues apace, especially under Mehmet II until Suleiman the Magnificent, who reigns from 1520 to 66. So that's kind of what's happening. And this is the pre-modern institutional background. Now, linking this to the final chapter on horizons, I've already said that this Ottoman institutionalization of religious life in the pre-modern context is utterly without precedent and parallel as far as I'm concerned. Now, it emerges throughout the course of the book, and I think most clearly in the final chapter on the futures or horizons of Turkish, modern Turkish theology, that the single most important ingredient in this discourse, in important respects, is the state. Why? And in this discussion, I'll be kind of combining elements that found throughout different elements of the book, rather than discussing a kind of blow-by-blow account of each chapter. So, just to give an example, of course, you have something I'll have to revisit, the reforms of the 1920s after the establishment of the Republic in 1923. That's a very important context. Phil argues that this does not actually stifle Turkish theology, but it causes it to explore new directions. And the argument is that Turkish theology is not, modern Turkish theology rather, is not inauthentic. It does emerge organically in important respects from the tradition. And already in the late Ottoman period, what is the key aim, if you like, of this theological project? It is demonstrating the existence of God, and Tawheed is absolutely central, because the main interlocutor already in the late Ottoman period is what, or the main challenge, is scientific materialism of the late 19th century, associated with figures like Ludwig Buchner. Buchner, by the way, and if you read Marwa Shakiri's reading Darwin in Arabic, I mean, Buchner was the key advocate of a trend known as vulgar materialism. The most crude, most materialistic expression, of course, founded on Darwin, but Darwin's relationship with the subsequent appropriations of his ideas is a complex one, as Shakri demonstrates. But yeah, so this was the main challenge, and in important respects has remained the challenge throughout the 20th century to modern Turkish theology. So whether it's, two of the many modern Turkish theologians, Phil so wonderfully discusses, obviously, not obviously, but Ismail Haqqi Izmirli dies in 1946 is a very key figure because he was quite preeminent in the first half of the 20th century. And much more recently, Bakir Topaloglu, my inclination is to say Oghlu, but I'm told that's wrong by Turkish friends, who dies in 2016, Allah yarhamu. He's most famous to us.
Oghlu is perfectly reasonable in Anatolia, but not in the north.
Fair enough. So now Topaloglu publishes in 1970 a very influential book called, I think the translation is The Existence of God According to the Philosophers and Theologians in Islam, something like this. And again, it's four grounds, although there are differences we can discuss later perhaps, this question of knowledge of God and how one establishes it. At the heart of modern Turkish theology, Phil says several times, is this idea of belief of and commitment to Tawheed in the modern context with all that entails. Now, returning to this point about the state, Phil says, for example, in 1990, there were 9 theological faculties in the whole of Turkey, 9. In 2019, or as of 2019, there are 105. Now, he acknowledges very explicitly that the AKP has revolutionized theological discourse in Turkey in all kinds of ways, but most importantly, institutionally. And both you and I, Usama, and I'm sure many of our listeners have come across Turkish PhD students sent on government scholarships. At every university I've been involved in, either hired that or based in as a student in the, since I've been an undergrad, you've had Turkish government scholarship students. So this massive capacity building project. In correspondence with Phil, he told me that the project of editing classical texts has only really taken off in the last 2 decades. So the AKP have done a number of other things as well. They have massively improved, and I know this is also true from an economic perspective in terms of women's employment as well and access to education. There's lots of data demonstrating this. Massively improved women's, let's say, access to religious spaces and even to some extent religious authority. So most recently the appointment of women as deputy muftis and as preachers. So in 2013, 48% of preachers hired by the Diyanet being the Ministry of Religious Affairs established in 1924, were women. That's a massive amount. In Istanbul, I think the figure was 44%. So you're talking about really substantial numbers, hundreds of preachers. So this now. I should also say something about nation, and I'll make this the last point, Usama, before we
No, no
kind of.
and
there's so much to say. Yeah, there's so much to say about this book, and it's always exciting to me, especially when I'm looking at something I don't know pretty much at all about. So that explains my talkativeness, I guess.
Most welcome.
So, well, for you, maybe not for listeners. So, in terms of nation, one very curious thing for me as an outsider, someone who's not Turkish, does not read Turkish, and as we said in the previous episode, is not in any way a nationalist. The appropriation of al-Maturidi and his theological school in Turkey. Now, this turns out to have actual longer roots than I expected. So, Phil says the first reference to Maturidi as a Turkish theologian it occurs in 1869, but really during the Republican period, based on, I think, an article published in 1932 on Turkish theologians. This idea becomes a trope in modern Turkish theology. Although based on the sources, we can't actually know with any certainty what Maturidi's native language was. From their perspective, he's from Central Asia. This is good enough to make him a Turk. We do know, incidentally, as Phil puts it, that his Arabic in the Kitab al-Tawheed is, I think he says, highly idiosyncratic, which is a polite way of saying he had bad Arabic syntax. This is a point that Ulrich Rudolph in his book on Maturidi discusses at some length. There are kind of Persianisms in his Arabic. So anyway, so this appropriation...
I mean, not to sort of like, not necessarily to question the Turkish sort of perspective on this, but Persianisms would suggest, you know, Persian roots, right, over Turkic ones. But
but you know, even if his native language wasn't Persian, it could be that the language of culture and so on in the area was Persian. I mean, same thing we find in Central Asia in the 19th century. In Bukhara, I mean, we had an episode on the great book by James Pickett. So yes, the appropriation of Maturidi now. For me, there's a big difference between or not necessarily, but often there is a big difference between appropriation and scholarship, historical scholarship, and intellectual history. Why? And Phil is aware of this, of course, because appropriation of the crude nationalist kind one tends to find in much of 20th century Turkey, particularly in the early Republican period, is or leads to almost invariably the distortion of the agenda and you know, the actual claims that al-Maturidi is making in his context, in the same way that people who say, you know, in a glib way from the late 19th century onwards, oh, I'm a Mu'tazili, based on this very rudimentary understanding of what Mu'tazilism is and what it entails. It's a kind of similar appropriation. So as someone who aspires to be an intellectual historian, I have serious problems with this appropriation. Nonetheless, it does eventually lead to good scholarship. And I stress eventually, because he credits the nationalist context with generating an interest in al-Maturidi, and to a great extent that is true. He says that since 1987, there have been more than 80, I can't remember the specific number, more than 80 master's and PhD dissertations on al-Maturidi in Turkey. Now, I'm somewhat skeptical about this link between nationalism and scholarship, or the nationalist context and scholarship, again, based on this distinction between appropriation and actual intellectual history. Why? Because although, as we know from Sezgin's History of Arabic Literature, the manuscripts of the tafsir of Maturidi were plentiful and well known, even in the mid 20th century. However, it's not until 2003 that Bekir Topaloglu edits, along with Muhammad Arutchi, whatever that name is, edits, and this is the edition of the Kitab Tawheed of Maturidi we all use. Now, Maturidi's Kitab Tawheed is a Unicum manuscript that's found only in the library of Cambridge University. And it was not widely used or ever copied as a theological textbook, it seems. And I remember Ulrich Rudolph saying in his book, this is partly because of or someone else perhaps, partly because of the challenging Arabic. The tafsir, on the other hand, was really produced by the students of Maturidi, and the Arabic style is more polished, it's often said. Now, if the nationalist context had truly generated a scholarly interest in Maturidi, then why, one could ask, do they not actually bother to edit his works until the AKP comes into power, effectively, So, and it's funny because, or one could say ironic, that actually the first people to edit Maturidi's works are Arab scholars publishing in Arab presses. So did you say that the first sort of edited editions were coming out in the 90s rather than the 2000s, or? No, so the critical edition that we use of Kitab Tawheed came out in 2003, Topaloglu and Arutchi. And the tafsir in the best edition, Darul Mizan, I think it is in Istanbul, 2005 to 2011, an 11-volume edition, and later an 18-volume translation came out. And we'll have to talk about translations later into Turkish. I mean, I once visited the Isam library in the company of a very dear friend who was kind enough to show me around. And I remember my jaw dropping because the amount of energy that's been invested in translation You find massive multi-volume works, entirely translated into Turkish. I remember seeing Razi's tafsir and
I remember seeing Radd al-Muhtar of Ibn Abi.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing is very common. And as far as I'm aware, this project, which I imagine really takes off, especially in the 21st century, I think that extent of translation is probably unprecedented among non-Arabophone Muslims. I mean, I'm sure in order to have lots of translations, but massive multi-volume works, I really don't think there's a comparison. And most of it is recent as well. Why is that happening, by the way? I mean, it goes back to arguments made in the early Republican period. M. Brett Wilson says in his excellent book on Quran translation and printing, especially in the Turkish context, the Turkish parliament grants funds in 1925 for Quran translation, and in 1928 some of the kind of theological faculty of the Ottoman Darul Funun, which in 1933 becomes Istanbul University, a very fine institution to this day, are involved in producing a report that becomes very influential on subsequent religious policy in the Republican government. Why? So it's later claimed that some of the contributors to this report actually didn't agree with parts of it, and it was published kind of without their involvement. But this report in 1928 was very radical in its implications, and for Phil, the late 1920s marks the point at which you could say Turkish theologians say this far and no further, in the sense that they're willing to renegotiate, large domains of Islamic law. Phil has problems with that translation, but it's the one I'll stick to. And other aspects of Islam as a religion, and very fundamental, I should say, because Phil repeats it many times, fundamental to modern Turkish theology, and in modern theology generally, one could say, is the distinction between the eternal and essential elements of religion and its contingent aspects. And this is something all these theologians are involved in the discussion, elaboration of in various ways. Now, by the late 1920s, it comes to be clear to the overwhelming majority of Turkish theologians that certain things come to be fixed as far as Islamic law is concerned and are not subject to change. And these are especially ritual, certain fundamental beliefs, but ritual. So ritual is not up for debate in important respects, which is a very kind of Protestant approach to religion, one could say. And one of my criticisms, I don't have, I would say, any major criticism of the book, but some details here and there of the book is, Phil translates Sharia at one point as Islamic ritual law. Now, the ibadat take up no more than a third of any work of positive law for Ru' al-Fiqh. So I think this is a problematic translation. A quarter to a third is reasonably typical. And the Deen and Dawlat distinction we'll come back to as well. Sure. But so, and the tafsir, as I said, so where is Kitab al-Tawheed first published or an attempt to edit it? Fathullah Khulaif in 1970. So the Turkish translation comes out in 2002 and the Arabic edition by these Turkish scholars in 2003. That's a gap of several decades. The tafsir comes out in, of course, the Turkish edition is the superior one, in an Arabic edition in Beirut in 2004, in another Arabic edition in 2005, also published in Beirut. And then only in 2005 do you begin to have this massive Turkish, this excellent scientific edition in Turkish. So it's not clear to me always that this nationalist appropriation of al-Maturidi has actually generated the best. It does eventually lead to it. And Phil is obviously very critical of nationalism himself in various contexts. So there's lots more to say, but we should perhaps now
sort of open up the discussion. So I just want to remind viewers, and we have a few. Thank you for joining. That you can comment in the chat on Facebook and on YouTube, and we're happy to take your questions, inshallah, in a moment. I'm going to take this opportunity to engage in a conversation with Omar, of course. And, some people have written comments already. I just want to say wa alaikum salam to Muhammad Hilal Hussain from Bangladesh, actually. So I just wanted to actually ask you, a few of these questions that came up in the course of that discussion, or as you were talking, a number of questions were just coming up to me, and I sadly, due to sort of like preoccupations which I discussed with you just before we came on, I've not been able to dedicate as much time to reading the book this week, but and I have every intention to. Turkish is one of the languages I spent some time learning in my postgraduate career. And I'm very interested in sort of this yeni kalam, as they say, the new kalam that ilm al-kalam that is developed there. So this will, inshallah, be something I explore in the future. But I'm kind of curious to know it about sort of just this on the last point that you mentioned about the kind of a quasi-Protestant approach to saying ritual is really the core of what's not up for debate. Ritual is what is to be protected. There were moves in the early 20th century, and as far as I understand it, it continued very late on. It became standard norm that the adhan was given in Turkish.
Yes, until 1950.
Right.
Now, it's interesting, he talks about this Republican agenda for religion, and already, is it Gökalp or someone else, had expressed the wish that ritual life be kind of made available in Turkish. And from a Protestant perspective, it's really inner belief and not ritual that's the key thing. But the Turkish element combines both ritual and inner belief.
Not to interrupt the flow exactly, and inshallah, I look forward to your fuller answer. But I got this impression from Phil, and I actually don't know Phil personally. I happen to know his wife, who is a great scholar as well.
It's cited in the book.
Cited extensively in the book. We bumped into each other at the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Herndon, Virginia, several years ago. But I haven't been in touch with her since, unfortunately. But yes, I in terms of like the impression I got from the assumptions about what religion was in the book. Came across to me as somewhat Protestant as well. So, in a way that has been critiqued to a certain extent in the sort of discourse on religion. And I wonder if that's me misreading superficially just the first two chapters.
No, I mean, I think, and it's ironic because Phil does not come from that particular tradition of Christianity.
Right.
But
it's a ubiquitous conception of
religion,
of course, in secondary literature.
And he talks about modern Turkish theology kind of carefully delimiting the domain of religion to these areas, which for me is, I mean, the ibadat muamalat distinction obviously exists in pre-modern Islamic thought, but it doesn't mean the things it means in the modern period, basically. Yeah. And to a large extent in the pre-modern period, this distinction is very artificial. So you'll find jurists saying things like, in the ibadat, you cannot apply analogy, which is rubbish because they do it all the time, no less than they do in the muamalat. Anyway, all kinds of examples could be given to undermine this distinction. For me, in certain forms, this distinction is a kind of implicit secularism. And certainly the distinction between the fundamental or essential precepts of religion and its contingent elements is a distinction that is very much adopted and supported and advocated by the secular Kemalist government as well. Right. Now, I forget which point I was on before, so perhaps you could remind me.
I mean, my earlier question was about the sort of ritual, sort of the fact that in a place like Turkey, the adhan was still given, and you said...
In Turkish, yes. So, in this 1928 report, the suggestion is seemingly even broader than that Turkish be used for prayer. And even more radical suggestions that Phil mentions, such as, the use, one thing that's actually not radical, I was discussing this with Aaron Rock-Singer, whose book has a very important discussion of this, the idea of prayer in shoes. Now, the irony is that Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya and even the kind of Salafi Wahhabis later on, in Saudi, and still the position of Sheikh Muqbil of Yemen famously is, very much advocating prayer in shoes, but in the Turkish Republican context, this is seen as anathema and so on.
Sure.
But Aaron Rock-Singer in his forthcoming book has a very important chapter on this discussion of prayer in shoes. And the use, another suggestion by this 1928 report is the use of musical instruments in worship. I didn't see it in this book, but I've read elsewhere, if memory serves, that there were even suggestions that pews be used in worship. So effectively, Muslims worship in something like a church. Now, to us, this sounds unbelievable, but in that period, all kinds of options were explored, one could say. Right. I mean, unsurprisingly, in 1928, they adopt the Latin script. That is a pretty radical transformation. Right. Now, how is it you could say the Ottoman Empire becomes the Turkish Republic? The Caliphate abolished in 1924. He says the Sultanate is abolished in 1924, but it's abolished in 1922. So we do have this distinction between the Sultan and Caliphate. Right. How do you have the last kind of great Muslim empire in many respects become this uber secular laiclic, to use the Turkish term, republic, where in 1925 you have the hat law, I think it's in 25, banning the wearing of fezzes and or torbushes, you could say, and turbans and so on, and a range of other reforms, the abolition of madaris, the creation of the Diyanet in 1924, which is basically a state entity for controlling the expression of religion. There's no other way to put it. Right. Interestingly, in Amit Bein's work, Bein, who is a Princetonian, it's based on his Princeton PhD thesis, but it's a nice work that Phil cites. You have this idea that for many decades, the secular republic did not, or the elite, the political elite, did not really trust their own Diyanet. And that's very interesting.
I mean, you can understand the sorts of problems that might arise in sort of, okay, you create this entity that's there to control religion on behalf of the state, but who's going to populate it? You're going to have these people trained.
Absolutely. In traditional religion, and to a great extent, this explains some of the continuities. So obviously you have, and he mentions three theologians whose name I'll hopefully remember. Ismail Haqqi Izmirli, of course. Dies 46 in 1946, and all of these three figures, I should say, I should talk a bit about the institutional history of the Ottoman Dar al-Funun, which established first in 1864, goes through numerous incarnations. It's shut several times, reopens, eventually in 1933 becoming the Istanbul University. Right. Now, from 1912, you have for the first time the religious sciences being included and professors being appointed. And this and the kind of subject domain is known as the higher religious sciences or something like this.
So this was in which year? Forgive me.
1912.
12. Okay.
This continues until 1919 when it's shuttered. It then reopens in 1924. Where, for the first time in an institutional context, the word ilahiyat is used to refer to a department of the university. Now, following Tarana Wilkinson, whose important 2019 book, along with Felix Kerner's 2004 or 5 book, I forget, on revisionist Turkish Quranic hermeneutics, those are basically the only two book-length works of scholarship on modern Turkish theology. Now, Kerner is focused on revisionist Quran hermeneutics. Tarana Wilkinson focuses on two key theologians and brings Turkish theologians, brings them to dialogue with broader developments in theology. Phil's book is much broader in scope.
Right.
So you do find an attempt to elaborate the institutional history of modern Turkish theology in Felix Kerner's book, for instance, but it's kind of discussed at greater length here. Okay. So, from 1924 until 1933, if I'm not mistaken, that's the period when you have these three members of the faculty who are major theologians in the early to mid-Republican period. Ismail Haqqi is merely this towering figure whom he writes about quite a lot, but really deserves 100 monographs or something. His work on yet.
How would you put him in a sort of among equivalent figures in the Arab-speaking world?
He's a heavy hitter, so he's basically as big as they come. Their
Or the
agendas are
equivalent
so
of the Sheikh
different.
Islam of the Ottoman Empire, like Ibn Saud or something like this.
Now, that goes back to important questions about Turkish theology.
Right.
So, Ismail Haqqi Izmirli, of course, is living in the late Ottoman period as well, but his agenda is quite clearly shaped by the requirements of modern Turkish theology and the context of modern Turkish theology. Remember, he dies in 1946.
Right.
Rida, I would say, in important respects, although he's also concerned with many of these questions, right? And his Sheikh Abdu and Izmirli publishes in Sirat al-Mustaqim, this kind of well-known modernist late Ottoman periodical, which is published from 1908 to 1925.
Right.
And it translates many things from Abdu and Afghani. And Izmirli does advocate reform of fiqh, but using kind of classical usul and so on. So he is, you could say, somewhat more conservative than the other two figures I will discuss. And they were all part of this key institutional context towards the last years of the Ottoman Dar al-Funun, on which there is this book translated into English by Ihsanoglu, House of the Sciences, by, I think, OUP, that came out in 2019 or something. Interesting book. Although he doesn't discuss the religious element at all in that book. So Izmirli is one of them. A guy who dies in 1947, Mehmet Sharafuddin Yelkaya, something like this. I feel bad. Yeltkaya. I'm bad with Turkish names.
Okay. Is it
Yeltkaya. I think it's Yeltkaya.
Is it with a C or a K?
K. Yeltkaya. I think it is. Yeltkaya, who we will assume this is his correct name. And it's not, I'm not being discriminatory. I just struggle with Turkish names. Yeltkaya is interesting because he is a personal associate of Gökalp. He publishes in he becomes the head of the Diyanet in 1942, if I remember rightly.
Right.
Nationalism is far more pronounced in the work of Yeltkaya than it is in Izmirli. It's not really prominent at all.
Right.
Which, of course, means I sympathize more with Izmirli. And the final three of the three he discusses at this period, who dies in the 1950s, is Yusuf Zia Yorukan. That's the guy.
Thank you. I'm looking up the names.
Yeah, so I don't have my notes with me, but Yorukan is interesting in various ways as well. And of course, he discusses many other figures. One very significant one, and I'll really, kick myself if I don't remember her name, Hidayat Tuksal, whom he says is probably, in the context of modern Turkish theology, the first, you could say, Muslim feminist theologian. Right. And now, of course, there's lots of literature and discussion of this idea of Muslim theology. There are, edited volumes and so on this, and conferences and all manner of things. But she focuses, it seems, mostly on the hadith corpus, and she makes many familiar points about the patriarchal nature of the tradition, that this attitude contravenes the Quran in important respects. And Phil has a nice discussion of her discussion of the sutra and what interrupts prayer, and this hadith where, woman and so on. Yes. That we will probably not.
Abu Huraira about, or Ibn Umar, it might have been.
It was Abu Huraira who critiques. Yes, and I recently remembered there is an excellent translation and study of Zarkashi's book on this subject by Sophia Abdurrahman, Leeds University 2019. It's available online.
Okay, I mean, one of my own teachers, Muhammad Akram Nadwi, who's written Al-Wafa fi Asma' an-Nisa. As far as I understand, he compiled a bigger book than both the Zarkashi and the Suyuti on this.
Very interesting. So, be nice to see that published. Now, he says that Abu Dawood and Imam Malik adopted Aisha's view that this interruption or a woman passing in front and so on does not invalidate the prayer.
Right.
But many fuqaha, of course, did adopt this view, and Aisha's criticism is based not simply on some kind of feminist commitment. It's based on the fact that she actually, the Prophet ﷺ prayed in front of her and when with her on the bed, and this was not or did not pose a problem.
Yeah.
So Tuksal makes the point that the fact that you're ignoring this very kind of powerful claim based on direct knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ's practice in prayer is a kind of misogyny, which is an interesting point. But as I said, really her work seems to be focused mostly on, although she says...
Does he transliterate the term for misogyny in Turkish by any chance? Do you know?
Maybe he does, but honestly I don't remember.
That's fine, I can look that up. And forgive me, what's the name of the scholar in Leeds?
Leeds, Sophia Abdurrahman.
Okay, thank you.
Abdurrahman as two words with an E for Rahman, if that makes sense. If I'm not mistaken, she's the wife of Mustafa Sheikh, who wrote the book on the Qadi Zadalis, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing as well. Anyway, so it's this element I think deserves much more research. Again, you could easily write a book or more, I'm sure, on Tuksal if I haven't screwed up her name. So these are all very important. He discusses in the chapter on humanity, he discusses, maybe it's humanity or God, I forget which chapter. He discusses 4 theologians, 2 of whom are Topalolu and Izmirli, and then 2 others whose names I'm not great at remembering, unfortunately.
But for the record, all the names that you've pronounced from the Turks, I mean, overwhelmingly, you're doing an excellent job with it. So I don't know why you're so anxious about it.
But anyway. So this is, it's a really interesting discussion, and of course, much of many of the ideas will be familiar to us.
Right.
I mean, it's true that there might be distinctive elements of Turkish theology, and certainly the context makes it very interesting. I mean, he says it's basically taken for granted in modern theology that Islam and democracy go well with each other and are perfectly compatible.
Right.
And this assumption or argument seems to be quite an old one, and perhaps compared to other contexts, I would guess, based on his presentation of this point.
If you think of the equivalent in the Indian subcontinent, which is Maududi, which is extremely influential in the Arab world and somewhat influential in a place like Turkey, the opposition to popular sovereignty as a concept is fundamental, and it's powerful in the middle of the 20th century. So I mean, there's something very interesting about having these kinds of, because my impression is that popular sovereignty is one of these concepts which the modernists kind of adopt and normalize, and you have the Young Turk movement and so on, which really...
And beginning already in 1865 with the movement that becomes known as the Young Ottomans, ideas of liberal constitutionalism and hurriyat are already prominent and receive further elaboration later on, especially in the Republican period. I should probably say, sorry.
No, I mean, I was just going to say that it's interesting that it does seem that perhaps because of linguistic insulation to a certain extent between these different communities, the young Ottomans, I assume, are engaged mostly in Turkish writing. And I don't know if the extent to which they would actually be familiar with Arabic because,
I mean, among the ulama, it was the norm.
Among the ulama, it would have been the norm.
And even among, my sense is, even among certain kinds of bureaucrats.
Right, yes. I mean, Ottoman bureaucrats, you'd expect to know all 3 languages, right? So, but
yes, I mean, even into the 20th century.
At the same time, what's interesting is, simultaneously, if their deliberations are taking place in Turkish, they're not going to translate. And to a certain extent,
yes,
I wonder to what extent those sorts of ideas would get translated into
that's an excellent
question. Territories like Egypt and things like that.
This is an excellent question. Now, based on Phil's presentation, I mean, he says things like Abdu and Afghani and others are translated into Turkish.
Right.
I mean, I was recently having a discussion with a bookshop owner here in the UK who was telling me of his frustrations that books printed in Turkey by Turkish publishers do not circulate outside Turkey or so he says. Now, you have lots of partnerships between Turkish publishers, and especially Lebanese ones like Darab and Hazm, for instance, and those books circulate well. But to a great extent, because of linguistic and I'm sure other barriers as well, one could argue and it's something that's diminished in recent years, especially with the Syrian emigration. To some extent, the Turkish context was a bit insular. I mean, it's not like the Arab world where, you know, a book can be published in Egypt and read elsewhere easily.
I mean, it's interesting because I remember looking up, what's his name, Abdul Razak, Ali Abdul Razak's book in the Princeton Library. This would have been about a decade ago. And the Princeton Library is just wonderful in terms of, like, it's got a collection which goes back 100 years, sometimes older. So there are these texts there they've collected from decades ago. And I might have been looking for over a decade, right? And suddenly it's here. But I was looking for an older, like a first edition, you could say, of that text. And one of the ones that came up, when I looked it up, it was actually an Ottoman translation of it. Not even a Turkish translation, an Ottoman translation, it seemed, as I recall. So I assume
which is interesting because the book was published not many years before the language reform.
Yeah, it would have been.
I mean, literally, was it 1925, 26? Yeah.
25, 26.
And 28, I think, the Latin alphabet is. Of course, you have continuities. I mean, you can't abolish people's knowledge of Ottoman Turkish, even if you change the official alphabet. Izmirli is interesting for many reasons. Like Topaloglu, he emphasizes belief in God and the kind of refutation of materialism. So scientific knowledge has this tremendous prestige, I should say. And there is no incompatibility, according to Izmirli and others, between true scientific knowledge and revelation and so on. But Izmirli's key innovation, if you like, is something that had already been happening late in the 19th century. Think, for instance, of Hussein al-Jisr's. He has two famous rasail. Hussein al-Jisr, the theologian from Lebanese Tripoli, who was so well regarded, people were calling him in the 1880s the new Ash'ari. And he, in fact, received a caliphal pension, if I'm not mistaken. It's an important Lebanese family that continue to produce muftis, and his son, whose name escapes me, al-Jisr, was also the mufti of Tripoli. Anyway, the family went into politics later on, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, so Izmirli is preoccupied with this. Now, there are certain domains that science is not really able to explain to us, and this seems to be key to his argument. Something that Topaloglu also, I would guess, suggests. Topaloglu is interesting because Phil says he inverts Maturidis and the classical kalam and even post-classical kalam view on, gosh, I'm forgetting the technical term, but basically internal states. Wujdaniyat, that's it, Wujdaniyat, this term discussed by E.G. and Giorgiani. For E.G. and Giorgiani, these internal states or intuitive knowledge of God may be very compelling on the individual level, but it is useless to theology. For Topaloglu, however, and for others, but especially in Topaloglu, this idea of internal conviction and experience of God, the experiential element of belief is extremely important to establishing God's existence. So,
where would he get that from? It's interesting.
Well, I mean, he's not drawing it from the Kalam tradition, because for the Kalam tradition, that's basically unproven, undemonstrated belief. Maturidi talks about Hujjat al-Aql and the need for Burhan. He uses the term Burhan. And also the condemnation of taqlid, which is well known from the Kalam scholars.
Although, I mean, that sort of an argument would be very Taymiyan in a sense, I think.
Yeah, so this idea of fitra, it's mentioned in the book among some modern Turkish theologians, becomes important again.
Okay.
Which is a very interesting development. But so there's a lot going on in the book, and as always is the case, I'm sure I can't do justice to its arguments. But
I had like my usual sort of list of questions, but I wanted to specifically ask. You just mentioned Hussein al-Jisr, so this might be going a little further afield, but is there any secondary literature on him? I've not seen anything specific.
There is a bit. There is a bit. He is discussed in Marwa Shakiri's book. That's the first bit of secondary literature I saw on him. I think like Martin Rieksinger or someone has a book chapter on him. Like I would have to look it up to remember. Rieksinger at Aarhus University in Denmark is really one of the key scholars when it comes to debates about science among Muslims in the modern period. He's a fantastic scholar. He wrote his, I don't know if it was his PhD thesis or his habilitation thesis on Thana'ullah Amritsari, the Ahli Hadith scholar, which is very interesting. It's a big German book, which dropped from the right height, could kill a man. But yeah, so in terms of thinking, now I've kind of flitted between various chapters without any coherence, and that's just how my brain works, unfortunately. But in the chapter where he discusses the state as the context institutionally and otherwise for modern Turkish theology, he talks about three key phases. You have the mid-century onwards Republican period, because of course religious expression only really begins to flourish, and even critiques of nationalism and so on along religious lines only after 1950, when the Democrat Party come to power under Adnan Menderes, who's eventually hanged. Of course, that's incidentally when there then is given in Arabic again. No coincidence there. So you have that Republican period from the 1950s onwards, basically. Then you have the AK Party from 2002 till 2011. And the third stage is the AK Party rule from 2011 until 2019, when he argues they become much more authoritarian and so on. The AK Party emerges in the late 90s after the 1997 postmodern coup, as it were. And they succeed early on in attracting a very broad base of support, because their key planks of their political platform are things like defending the freedom of everyone. They even have the slogan that that they use, which was a surprise to me, that if any of us isn't free, none of us are free. This kind of theme. Things change in the 2010s, really as a result of the conflicts of the AK Party government with a range of enemies, including the Kemalist deep state, if you like, a term that Phil seems to be skeptical about, but for sure the judiciary and the military were, diehard, or represented as diehard Kemalists. He says, by the way,
out of Turkey to begin with, right?
So I didn't know that. So
that's where the rest of the Arab world and now the US uses it, right?
Yeah, very interesting. So the interesting thing is, he's very specific about using the term secular Kemalism, because Kemalism, without the qualification secular, is not really a coherent political program and reflects a range of attitudes towards, for instance, religion and the state. So secular Kemalism and so on. And in the early Republican period, for secular Kemalism, in a Schmittian sense, the key enemy was what they call irtija, I'm not sure how a Turkish person would say that, or reactionary attitudes, specifically conservative religious piety. So this was the other against which secular Kemalist ideology defined itself. Now, the AK Party has lots of electoral success from the early 2000s onwards, and the confrontation, he talks about the Gezi Park protests in 2013. In 2014, obviously, you have the rift with the Gulenists and so on. And in this context, Phil does make the point that in the book, he will sometimes give greater emphasis to particular theological currents in modern Turkey than would usually be the case. So he foregrounds them, you could say. So there is a discussion in the chapter on humanity, or maybe it's in the chapter on Horizons, I think, on LGBT kind of plus affirming theology. And this is a very recent development in the Turkish context, he argues. In 2008, the well-known activist Mohsen Hendricks visits Turkey and gives an interview that's very widely publicized. And it seems in Turkey in 2008, this is the first time the argument about the particular interpretation of the narrative of Lut alayhi salam, argued by Scott Kugel that it's not about homosexuality, it's about rape and so on. This is the first time the argument is presented, and it's widely publicized. And into the next year, so just a few months after this, one theologian who is very strongly aligned with AKP, Khairuddin or Hayratin, or however it's pronounced, Karaman, kind of publicly refutes this in the daily Yeni Shafak, if I remember rightly. So, and he mentions a range of, especially from that period onwards, you have very senior AK party officials and sometimes ministers and others, Davutoglu and at one point the Minister for Family and Women's Affairs, I think, criticizing homosexuality is not only problematic, but also, and this is the funny thing about this nationalist ethos, inauthentic to Turkish national identity or some such business.
Right.
So you have these arguments, and I think he acknowledges that feminists to a much lesser extent, but LGBT theology is marginal in the Turkish context. But he does give more attention to it than one would expect. And why? Because it highlights, I think, in interesting ways, the changes within the AK party and how, in important respects, he says, they continue the Kemalist statist project, right? So as part of their platform, when they come to power, they want to weaken state control over religion. Right. However, in the interests of promoting what he characterizes conservative social values, they kind of reverse this trend in important respects and make it very clear that their commitment to a human rights agenda does not embrace gay rights or whatever, or what have you. And Courtney Dorroll, his wife, which is quite cool to be able to cite your wife like that, I think. I always find it amusing.
Absolutely.
Brilliant scholar. She speaks of Erdogan's, or she speaks of neo-Ottomanist Erdoganism, if I'm not mistaken. This is the term she uses. Okay. So you have this interesting trend.
Her work on the teaching of Islam, is that?
I've only read it in Phil's book, to be honest. Right. I'm sure it's great, but this is the interesting thing in terms of the horizons and future of Turkish theology. I mean, Turkish theology has emerged in this strongly statist context and laiclic context for much of its history. The AK party, he says, has not seriously challenged secularism. Right. You do have calls from the 1960s to the 1980s, he says, even advocating an Islamic, the establishment of a Muslim state based on Sharia norms. He says that after the 1980s, this becomes very, very marginal in the mainstream of Turkish discourse. And this is really interesting to me personally.
Sorry, forgive me, I missed that. I was just making a note. What becomes marginal?
So in the 1960s to 80s, he says you do have Islamist critiques in Turkey, even of secularism, and very strident critiques advocating the establishment of some kind of Muslim polity in Turkey.
Right.
Although Khairuddin Karaman says you can have an Islamist state that is also democratic, but this does not seem to be the mainstream in Turkey, although he is an AK party kind of follower. Now, this is really interesting to me personally because
seem to be the mainstream in Turkey in the 1960s or even today.
Today.
Right.
So,
I mean, the AK party is largely a secular enterprise.
I understand, but so from the 1960s to 80s, this Islamist critique was much more prominent than it is today. That's what he's saying. Now, this is very interesting, and I always found it weird that, for instance, you have, conversations with friends in Turkey who are, observant and religious and all this, and they don't see a problem with serving in institutions that in other contexts, so serving as court judges, for instance, in secular domains, that say in Egypt would be seen as very problematic by many religious Muslims, or certainly, MB leaning or whatever you want to say.
I mean,
now
this is interesting actually, because
Yeah.
there has been a shift within those sorts of sort of groups as well.
I mean, the Nahda, of course.
I mean, there's another, but that's on a completely different sort of. That's that's not really in this tradition anymore, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, they're resembling the Turks more than they, more and more. In a sense, the Turks are the sort of pioneers of this kind of post-Islamism, you could argue. And so, yeah, I mean, I think...
What's that? Man sanna sunnah.
Well,
anyway.
but at the same time, what's interesting for me is if you look at the discourse of the, tatbiq al-Sharia, that's not really very salient, I think, in post-2011 Muslim Brotherhood discourse at all. It's more about...
Yeah, but in Turkey it's been marginal for much longer. He says that even among the religious, he says polling in the last few decades has routinely put support at Sharia, however that's defined in Turkey, or at least the kind of head punishments, let's say, well below 10% in Turkish society. I mean, if you compare that with Pew data from 2013 in Pakistan, or even in Iraq or Palestine, there's no comparison. And this is clearly a function of this particular national history that has impacted the religious classes no less than the kind of more secularized ones.
So, this is where, if I can sort of circle back to some of the points you were making about the AKP as well. So I remember walking past, last time I was in Turkey was a couple of years ago, and walking past an AKP building, and there was a big sign of the AKP. And I can't remember the Turkish off the top of my head, but I read it, and I was like, wait, that literally means, like, sovereignty belongs to the people. It says it on the AKP plaque, prominently as part of the... And I was like, it's fascinating, because a statement like that is kind of blasphemy for a lot of Islamists. And this is ostensibly an Islamist... Or
they would at least seek to qualify it by saying... And as one of the Pakistani constitutions says, that the sovereignty is delegated by God to the people. Which is a very different formulation.
Yes, which is a...
And we have to have an episode on Andrew March's second book at some point. Yeah.
Inshallah. I mean, but that's a very explicit Maududian kind of like intervention, saying, well, sovereignty belongs to God ultimately. I think that was his sort of... That articulation is his major contribution to
And this is also, by the way, I remember discussing with a Turkish friend, in the late Ottoman context, in the constitution, it's framed in these kinds of terms. It's, it's not, they haven't stripped God out of the picture, as it were.
Right. And so, I mean, that's, when you said earlier that the AKP hasn't really sort of like contested secularism.
Well, this is what Phil says, of course. I'm dependent on his knowledge as a specialist.
And not just that, I mean, there was a bit of an uproar in Egypt, I think.
When Erdogan gave this speech in 2012 or 13?
I want to say 2012, but once the Muslim Brotherhood had come into power potentially. And he
as I remember, the main argument, correct me if I'm wrong, was Muslims have nothing to fear from secularism or something like this. Words like that.
Something along those lines, but I mean, the line which I recall, and I need to actually go revisit that sort of speech at some point, is that actually you need to actively advocate a secular state. That should be what you as Islamists are doing. And it's like,
that can't have gone down well.
No, it couldn't have gone down well, because in Egypt,
it didn't go down well.
the quote-unquote secularists are basically all for, no, we need tatbiq sharia in the sense of, like, not tatbiq sharia, but we have sharia in the constitution, and they're defenders of the Azhar because it's a counterweight to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, like, there's this very fascinating, ironic sort of state of affairs.
That's really interesting. I want to kind of build on that point to make another distinction. One of my friends, John, who often comments, he's curiously silent in this episode, but I think he's watching. John is Turkish, basically. And I often have this conversation with him about the different dynamics in Turkey versus, say, Egypt, a great kind of point of comparison. And among ulama who are kind of legacies of influenced by the legacy of late Ottoman, ilm, and even opposition to the secular republic. So very recently, Muhammad Amin Siraj, rahimahullah, passed away, alim, who was, I think, the last one of the major students of Al-Kawthari. Now, I remember my friend, so this is anecdotal evidence, if you like, saying that And for one thing, by the way, this tension between Islamism and traditional ilm is not as present, or was not as present in Turkey as it is in Egypt. Why? Amin Siraj translated في ظلال القرآن into Turkish.
Right.
That's a major undertaking.
Right.
And an
it's
interesting
enormous
choice of
book.
text. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, he says that among these Phil focuses really on academic theologians for the most part and some public intellectuals, but among these conservative ulama, many affiliated with Sufi Turuq and so on, you had a very serious critique, often stifled and suppressed and repressed in various ways, of the kind of Republican project.
Right.
And it was expressed by people like Siraj.
Right.
And what my understanding is that after Islamists, especially in the era of Erbakan onwards, come to participate, or not necessarily Islamists, AKP, not really Islamists, after these figures influenced by Sufi movements and movements inspired by Nursi, who dies in 1960, after they come to participate in politics more and more, this critique really eventually disappears, right? So that's really interesting. Now, another point, a figure who's not mentioned at all in the book, which I found a curious omission, and one whom is a very interesting point of contrast and comparison with modern Turkish theology, is the great Mustafa Sabri. Why? Of course, because he's a Shaykh al-Islam, and his mawqif al-ilm, al-aql wal-ilm, is basically, it sounds almost exactly like the Yani Kalam book of, so he refutes Buckner in that book, for example. He's also very established, he emerges from the late Ottoman context. He's a Shaykh al-Islam, what more do you want? He's also very concerned with the refutation of materialism and establishing the proof of God. Now, that book is written in Arabic. I think it's written in Arabic and maybe only translated into Turkish later, but I'm quite confident it was written in Arabic because he spends time in Egypt
at the time. And
he spends time in Egypt. Now, that omission is curious because the fact that he's writing this in Arabic, and of course one of the distinctive things about modern Turkish theology, it's written in this new language of modern Turkish. What really is distinctive about modern Turkish theology? Because you have a figure who's part of this Ottoman, clearly part of the late Ottoman ilmiya learned hierarchy, and is a public intellectual at the same time, who's making many of the same points as would be made. He's more conservative, to be sure, than someone like Izmirli, but he's making these points in Arabic. Now, Phil really stresses that the Turkish national secular context does not stifle the expression of theology, or it doesn't kind of hamper its expression in important respects. But for me, pretty much all of the interesting points made by modern Turkish theologians, with some variation as to detail, of course, have been made by modern theologians in other Muslim contexts, almost without exception.
Fascinating.
Whether it's the...
Bit of a damning sort of assessment, no?
Well, no, not of the book. I should qualify.
No, not
of the book,
but of sort of the of what Turkish theologians have.
Yes. Now I know that Phil is not sympathetic to the project of religious nationalism, and I'm not sympathetic at all to I'm hostile to the project of nationalism. But as I said in the last episode when this came up, and he does say that this has become less and less important to modern Turkish theology over time. And even with the work of Gökalp, Turkishness was understood not in racial or ethnic terms, but in cultural terms. I play football with a group of Turkish students every Friday, which is lots of fun. But anyone who's been to Turkey or interacted with Turkish people will know there's a great deal of clearly ethnic diversity and so on. You can see it in their faces and so on. But for us, again, returning to this point and following on from the point about Mustafa Sabri, nationalism is parochial, and late Ottoman horizons were basically cosmopolitan. Now, Kevin Reinhardt, in the very first episode of this series, lived in his fantastic book, Lived Islam. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to revisit it, but on pages 145 to 150 has a fantastic discussion of what's known as the Turkish Islam synthesis. This emerges, as Phil says, after the 1980 coup. And this is basically the Kemalist state apparatus's attempt to appropriate Islam and to subordinate it to the national story. Now, this is a process that already begins long before the 80s.
Right.
But it really reaches its peak from the 80s onwards. And what are one of the many religious problems, just to make it clear, with this form of Turkish nationalism is it as I think Reinhardt puts it beautifully, it subordinates Islam to the national story of the Turks. Right. Because the Turkish national story begins before the Turks are Muslim, and Islam has a certain prominence. One thing we should point out, he does kind of discuss Turkish independence and so on, but really a point that could have even received more emphasis, and perhaps it's in the thesis, I would have to revisit it. Yeah. How is the Republican Kemalist project even possible in the first place? And what happens to the Ottoman Empire in the Great War? Its Muslim character is accentuated by developments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13. Basically, the Ottoman Empire becomes radically much more and more Muslim in terms of population.
Homogeneous.
This continues, homogeneous, yes. This continues with population exchanges after the war and during the War of Independence. The Greeks leave Izmir.
What can I read about this incidentally? This is a history that I'm...
I mean, any history of... any history of modern Turkey, whether it's even this textbook even by Eric Zerker. No, I mean, I wouldn't use Lewis for anything, but Eric Zerker's book, it's a textbook, it's quite thick, but it's well done. Okay. A History of Modern Turkey, I think it's called. But even Caroline Finkel's book on the history, Osman's Dream, on the history of the Ottoman Empire. But any account of modern Turkey will mention this. Ahmed Feroz has this book, I think, about modern Turkey that's in the bibliography. Anyway, so you have, and the Ottoman Empire was far more badly affected than any other power participating in World War I in terms of population loss. I mean, up to a quarter of the Ottoman Empire's population die in 1916 to 17, and it's really catastrophic. Right. Something that's not appreciated. I mean, the best. And one of the authorities on this would, of course, be your colleague, Eugene Rogan. But although he has a book that focuses really on the Ottoman War, it talks a bit about, as far as I remember, the kind of collapse afterwards. But basically, you have this catastrophic, there's no other way to characterize it, these catastrophic events for the Ottomans, the World War I really begins in 1912 or so, and continues until the end of the War of Independence, when you have even more calamities and so on. But these basically allow, and of course Ataturk is the great Ghazi, not unironically, who leads the nation to its independence and very consciously seeks to distance it and cut itself from its past, as has been discussed at length by scholars like Serdar Poyraz has an excellent thesis on religion and science, and especially exploring things like materialism from the late Ottoman context into the Republican period. I mean, Ataturk is very clearly a product of late Ottoman materialism and positivism. Izmirli is also a product in the sense of that context, in the sense that for him, Ash'ari and Maturidi's interlocutors were, the philosophers of late antiquity, and also Aristotle and Manichaeans and all of these kinds of groups. Right. For Izmirli, the interlocutors of modern Islamic theology must instead be people like Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill and Henri Bergson even. And this, to some extent, this is a challenge that's still...
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing, and I feel that there is a certain dropping off after the early 20th century, but the Turkish context seems to be distinctive, at least in the Arabophone world. You do have people who begin to, and in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology, Said Osor Valley talks about these various attempts in the Ottoman context in the modern period. and Rotraud
and indeed in the
Wieland.
Indian context as well, incidentally. Sorry.
Yes, Rotraud Wieland. I mean, and Shibli Na'mani, of course, uses this idea of Jadid, the new Ilm al-Kalam as well. So it's something that across Islamdom beginning of the late 19th century.
Right.
But as a project, it seems, I mean, this is a huge claim to make, but it seems this project has been pursued more actively in Turkey, one could say, than elsewhere in the Muslim majority world. Wallahu alam, I mean, you'd have to go away and read all of these South Asian sources to make this assessment. I mean, Southeast Asia is also very interesting, of course. So yes, we haven't had any questions from any of the viewers.
Right,
I think
right.
Phil is viewing this, so he's welcome to post comments and corrections. Sure. And
I mean, I did.
Likes.
I mean, oddly enough, I had this sort of, I before I actually got to the book, a colleague sent me sort of a tweet by Phil on Tunisia, which is really a bit random. And okay. I was a little surprised, to be honest. I felt that, someone was making a comment about how what's happening in Tunisia, basically critiquing the notion that it should be called a coup, rather it should be primarily understood as a rejection of Islamism or Islamist politics, and he said, he added, I really appreciate this point regarding the rejection of Islamism. So this kind of, to a certain extent, this affected the way I was reading the book as well, because I suddenly read it as a kind of like, so the tweet actually says, I really appreciate this point of this being a rejection of Islamism. Many non-Muslims have for decades believed the shared but false Islamist and Orientalist claim that Islam is a political project and not a religion, thus eliding the fact that Islamism has always been controversial, which I just found a bit strange, considering when I was reading his book, he was pointing out that the young Ottomans, I think it was the young Ottomans, I don't think it was the young Turks, I can't remember the actual label he used, are very clearly the
young Ottomans are the ones who...
drawing on
he
the
doesn't
liberal
mention
tradition.
Yeah.
And that liberal tradition kind of does, in my estimation, constitute a significant rupture from the way in which sort of Muslims looked at the world. And I guess I'm particularly sensitized to this because I'm just about to publish a piece on the concept of Hakimiyya or sovereignty, looking at its genealogy through Islamic history. So
and the thing about the young Ottomans on whom Sharif Mardin has a book. Anyway, they actually built, they draw extensively on the Islamic heritage as well.
Right.
And I think from a modern point of view, one would unhesitatingly characterize them as Islamists. I mean, I did find this a very curious point when he's discussing, especially in the late Ottoman period, 20th century, this distinction between deen and dawlat, and he talks about the distinction Sharia and Qanun. I'm not very happy with how this has been elaborated. And the distinction between religion as the domain of the eternal versus politics. I mean, I did really wonder about exactly what these configurations look like in the late Ottoman context, when you have a caliph ruling who makes a big deal of the fact that he's a caliph, and where until 1926, as he points out, the Majalla is the civil code is, as Sami Ayyub scholarship has established, the Majalla is based overwhelmingly on late Hanafi doctrine. So this distinction between the secular and this worldly and deen and dawlat and so on, I think it needs perhaps a revisiting, because it's much more, what I would say is it's much more complex than the modern anti-Islamist argument gives it credit for.
Right. I mean, in any case, this is just a complete aside. I mean, I think it was a bit of an unfortunate intrusion on my reading of the text.
But perhaps it emerges from this interesting discussion of the AK party in the book. So there is perhaps some relation.
I mean, like for me, as someone who studies sort of not just Islamist, but looks at the Islamic political tradition, sort of going through history as part and parcel of the fiqh tradition, as it were, and deeply integrated within it. And the fiqh
Although it's
tradition
really,
being
for me, it's more part of the Kalam tradition than anything, ironically, given the
okay. I mean, like
books.
that's interesting. Like the concept of the imama specifically, you mean?
Yeah, so
Right.
you do find the political ideas featuring incidentally in
Yes, I mean
in
it's
fiqh
incidental, but
works,
it's
but
integrated in Kitab
yeah, for
al-Qada
sure.
and things like that. Yeah, or
And
Kitab
the
al-Siyaq.
exception
I mean,
being, for instance, in the Zaydi tradition, you
Right,
have
they have
actually in their works of fiqh,
of
in
Kitab
the
al-Imam.
sections on siyar, discussions of how to establish the imamate and so on.
Right.
To some extent, you could say the distinction is artificial, but yeah, I mean,
the thing is when Qadi al-Qudah al-Mawardi is writing his text, it's interesting to
the
me.
well-known Islamist al-Mawardi.
Oh, there's a hilarious line. This hilarious line in Shiraz Maher's unfortunately sort of horribly anachronistic at times book on Salafism and Jihadism, and he has this line where he basically says, Mawardi uses the term Hakimiyya, and I'm like, okay, let me look this up, and the source he cites doesn't have it, the Arabic text doesn't have it, none of the two translations in English has it. So I'm sort of wondering, I mean, I'd love to think of Mawardi as the great Islamist, and he didn't invent the term. It was so obviously embedded within the tradition. They used other terms for it. I mean, it's an innovation of a Urdu-speaking sort of modern
but
writer.
To some extent, some of these conceptual points are a case of kalimat haq yurad biha batil. I mean, okay, I will grant you that hakimiyya in that particular sense is a modern term, but going back to Rushayn Abbasi's very interesting thesis and ideas about the religious-secular distinction in pre-modern Islamic thought, I mean, I would build on that by saying that secular politics were not inconceivable to pre-modern Muslims, but they were not normative in any sense. Now, you did have non-religious registers available for discussions of politics, so, legitimacy in terms of descent from Genghis Khan or Timur, something like this. This is a non-religious frame of reference, but any kind, the idea of a secular politics being normative among Muslims is, of course, a purely modern development, really.
I mean, this Michael Cook makes the case explicitly, I think, in his sort of ancient religions, modern politics. I mean, yes, there were plenty of people who conceptually talked about secular politics, but it was never conceived of as being sort of something that could be countenanced from within an Islamic framework. And I think that's what makes it very...
And Rushayn also draws particular emphasis to the Persianate tradition and prior even to the Islamic period. We can't forget the late antique world was a highly confessional one. Unlike, say, the pagan Roman Empire, one's identity became articulated in the world of late antiquity primarily in terms of confessional identity, right? And religious
so I need to
conviction
qualify
and so
some
on.
of
And
the
Islam
things.
emerges in that period. It is if you like, the supreme expression of this principle in late antiquity. Because you have a state that is manifest, or a polity, we can say, that is manifestly confessional from the outset, and whose aim under, say, the Umayyads is explicitly world conquest. And Sean Anthony, in his recent book, we had an episode on, cites this wonderful line of poetry by Jarir or Farazdaq, I forget whom, saying that, we've been granted, dominion without end and all of this. And it's articulated in very much in triumphalist religious terms. That's the world in which Islam
Although, I mean, I should qualify some of my sort of discussion of this, and specifically about secularism, because I'm actually sort of still reflecting on a certain conception of secularism which takes it to be a religion. And so then, I'm trying to think about what the implications of that are. It's interesting because he does mention Durkheim at some point talking about religion, and I thought it's really fascinating. Like, my reading of Durkheim's conception of religion is radically different to the way he came across on the page in Phil's work. Because Durkheim basically argues that all society, religion is a ubiquitous human phenomenon that is present in all societies, and in a sense, like we in secular societies secularism can become a religion unto itself. Although I don't think she
interesting.
explicitly makes that
So
point.
I think the key connection with Durkheim in the book is the
Yes.
work of Zia Gökalp, in 1912 is appointed the first professor of sociology at the Dorroll Funun.
Right.
And he was very Durkheimian in his orientation.
Right.
Um,
Durkheim's book was published in 1912, so maybe like the
All right.
influence of Durkheim would have been sort of not
been
there
somewhat
yet.
later, but clearly, sociology, as I said, is one of the three main ingredients of the
Right.
kind of formation of modern Turkish theology.
Yeah.
And Gökalp
I mean,
distinguishes between culture and civilization. Civilization being a reflection of a human intervention, right? So, making this distinction, Gökalp is able to say that the Turkish people are able to remain Turkish while rejecting Ottoman civilization and embracing Western civilization.
Right.
The key problematic, or one of the key problematics for modern Turkish theology, as across the Muslim majority world, is this idea of Westernization progress.
Right.
And it's really interesting. I mean, when you read this stuff written in the 1920s and the 1910s, it actually becomes very irritating to me. All of this reference to progress, and it hasn't aged very well, right? Very well. But
it hasn't aged well at all. Yeah, and so I mean, like just that to draw on Durkheim for a little more. I mean, one of the things that I am trying to figure out is, have the wars of religion ever ended, right? I mean, if you reconceptualize so, we do have the Peace of Westphalia and all of that sort of thing, and a particular conception of religion is then sort of like sequestered from the political sphere in a very distinctly sort of, it in a sense traces the secular religious distinction that is found within the Christian tradition, which, I mean, fascinatingly, that the term Almani basically can be found in 5th century Christian writings, in Syriac or whatever it is that Rushain has unearthed. Incredible stuff. But at the same time, that particular distinction being used as a basis for saying, okay, well, the religious component, I mean, there's this other line which I read from, I'm just going to have a quick read from Phil's work, which I found quite striking, saying, in their famous letter from Paris, their place of exile, this is the young Ottomans, they argued that religion pertains to the domain of the spiritual and the afterlife, and is to be distinguished from worldly laws of the state. This argument was not meant to denigrate the value of religion, but rather to protect its true value, which I mean, that sort of understanding of these sorts of things, I find quite intriguing, because, in a sense, what you're saying is, in order to protect, for example, my grandfather, he's such a pure soul, and I want to take care of him. Let me shut him in some sort of closet, and no one can touch him, and he's saved from the sort of like dirt
corrupting
of the world
influence.
And the filth
I have questions about this characterization of the young Ottomans. I mean, even if they make the distinction from the perspective of 2021, they're Islamists, right? And yes, they are influenced by European liberal constitutionalist ideals, but they are also committed to their tradition. So they're not young Turk secularists, for example. Now, Ataturk emerges from this late Ottoman context, but he really accentuates this materialist element, and so on.
I have to do a lot more reading about early Turkey, so it's ironic.
There's really not much literature, by the way, on late Ottoman intellectual culture in English.
Right.
Some papers, Serdar Poyraz's thesis, I think, is really important. There's an edited volume by, I think, Elizabeth O'Dalgu or something like this, Ozdalga. And you have books, Sharif Maruddin and Maruddin, and others. But there's certainly scope for much more work to be done.
You've mentioned a number of books over the course of today. So, and as Phil's bibliography will be extremely helpful. And my impression is that there's a lot more to be had in his dissertation as well. So, hopefully that's available now publicly.
Yeah, and this is a great period. I mean, he's talked about the revival of Maturidi studies in Turkey, but I mean, in the last, not even 20 years, let's say in the last half decade or decade, in the Western academic context, including, of course, Phil himself, Dale Corrier, Angelica Broderson, many scholars who have published on Maturidism and its history. I know that Ramon Harvey has, as well as his book, which is a kind of...
Just published a new one as well.
Yeah, it's a modern Maturidi theology, and that's very interesting. Perhaps we can have an episode on it. He has articles forthcoming in, Orions about, and other journals, the Journal of the American Oriental Society, on, for instance, the textual history of al-Fiqh al-Akbar attributed to Abu Hanifa, and other things about the early history of Maturidism, specifically Rustughfani, the student of al-Maturidi, some of whose ideas we can recover from later works in quotation. There's really been a flourishing of Maturidi studies, especially in the last decade or half-decade in the Western academic context. Philip Bruckmeier of Vienna has published some very, very interesting articles. I mean, thank God he uploads them on his academia page, because many of these journals are very obscure, but the scholarship is excellent.
Thank you very much, Omar. I mean, I think just perhaps if you can sort of give us a final touch on sort of your thoughts on Phil's work. And in a sense, my last question was to ask to what extent, what can I get also from reading Phil's actual dissertation? Because my impression is it's larger than this work. I'm not sure how the pages of a dissertation kind of work out onto the printed page, but it's this work is pioneering. You can say very simply because there's hardly a literature, at least in English or perhaps even other European languages, on modern Turkish theology. What literature does exist is much less ambitious in scope. Wilkinson and Kerner's studies are both focused on specific figures or particular trends. Phil gives us the context in the late Ottoman period. He discusses, I've named maybe half a dozen modern theologians. He names even more, goes into some detail, points us to important primary sources and all kinds of things. So in that respect, it's a foundational work, really. And I look forward to subsequent publications on this by him. The main difference between, I think, this and the thesis is, especially in the first 3 chapters of the thesis, there's more focus on Maturidi and the subsequent history of his school. And that could be worked up into a second book project, I think, quite easily. So he's basically someone who's both a medievalist and a modernist, which is...
Yes, and does them both well, which is quite rare in my experience.
Well, thank you, Barakallahu fikum, Omar. I mean, this has really been sort of fascinating, eye-opening for me, and as I say, I always enjoy these particular episodes where I'm discussing with you, because you are, if you'll forgive me saying so, you're encyclopedic in your sort of...
Well, that's very kind of you, but really the book opened up new horizons and vistas for me in an area that I know very little about because of the language barrier. So thank you to Phil for this really important study.
Absolutely. Obviously, each week we're most indebted to the sort of actual author who spent many years putting a particular work together. So thank you very much to Phil. And I suppose, Omar, we have another 2 weeks with you, inshallah.
I believe it's one.
Sorry?
I believe it's just one more, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, forgive me. Just the one. Okay. Just
because we had 4 books and this is the 3rd of them. Yes. Next week we shall be discussing, inshallah, Mustafa Bannister's The Abbasid Caliphate of Cairo, 1261 to 1517, which is a substantial work, as you can see. And about half of the book is an actual history of the caliphate in this period, and the second half kind of discusses the more conceptual stuff and the intellectual history stuff. So it's a major contribution, I'm sure, even before having read it, that builds in important ways on Mona Hassan's important work that really excavates the continued importance of the caliphate post-1258. But it's a more institutional history.
Yeah, we look forward to that. We look forward to I hope to get my sort of hands on the book and have as much of a read of. It's a sizable book. My impression is it's like 400 or 500 pages.
About 500.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so inshallah, I look forward to sort of having as much of a read of it as I can. And until next week, we, as I always say, please do join us in a week's time. And if you like, follow and subscribe, that'll it'll give you reminders about these, inshallah. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.